the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, and welcome back to Truth in My Days radio broadcast. I'm Sonia. Today I'm talking to John Torres. So, what do you have for us?
We have talked about apologetics as giving reasons for our beliefs when we are asked, as we're commanded to do in 1 Peter 3:15. When people challenge us, we have to give answers to those challenges. This we called defending the faith, and we must certainly do it.
What?
Let me suggest a principle that can be helpful as we reach out to people with the gospel, and it is this: the best defense is a good offense. So repeat, the best defense is a good offense.
I've heard that.
We see it in sports, for example. Hockey, as long as you keep the puck in the other team's zone, the other team can't score. The greatest defenseman in the history of hockey, Bob Yore, for my money, perhaps the best player ever, revolutionized the game by making offense integral to his defensive play. He actually won 2 scoring titles while winning 8 Norris trophies as best defenseman in what was essentially an 8.5-year career. In fact, back in the old days, the Canadian hockey team was so powerful compared to European teams that in one whimsical game in the 1924 Winter Olympics, Canada was beating Czechoslovakia 30-0. And the Canadian goalie actually left his net and was along the sideboards chatting up the ladies in the stands. He didn't even feel a need to defend his goal because of the powerful offense that kept the game entirely in the other team's end.
I bet those ladies were impressed.
Earl Weaver, a colorful former manager of Major League Baseball's Baltimore Orioles, said the key to winning was, and I quote, pitching, defense, and the 3-run homer. So you see, defense was not enough. You needed the pitching, you needed the defense, but you needed to bring in that offense as every once in a while, the 3-run homer.
But this principle doesn't hold only for sports, though, does it?
No. I'm not much of a chess player myself. I'm told you're quite a bit better, Sonia. But I'm told that the same principle holds there. When you're playing chess, you have to move your pieces to attack the other side aggressively. If you play only defense, you will eventually lose. And of course, it holds in actual warfare. There have been quite a number of examples of this during the American Civil War. In 1861, General George B. McClellan was made general-in-chief of the Union forces, and he just would not take the offensive. He was always afraid to pursue the Confederate forces after a battle, even though he had the numerical advantage in manpower. He actually was given the command of the armies, and he fortified them around Washington, D.C., and when the Southern forces invaded the North, and he defeated them at the Battle of Antietam, the Confederate forces were so badly decimated that they began a retreat south. The war could have ended much more quickly if McClellan had aggressively pursued and engaged those retreating forces, but he just wouldn't. He was so focused on defense. He was afraid what would happen if we went on offense, and as a result, he ended up getting relieved of his position, and the war just dragged on and on and on. So it's necessary. Offense is necessary, and that applies to apologetics as well.
Okay, so how does it apply to apologetics then?
For example, watch some formal debates between Christians and Muslims. The clever Muslim apologist likes to pick the debate topic that allows him to double down on offense. Most of the debate sees the Muslim attacking the trustworthiness of the Bible, trying to point out contradictions, claiming literary dependence among the gospel books, anonymity, that the gospel books weren't written by who they supposedly were written by. And the Christian spends most of the debate on the defensive, backpedaling, trying to answer these challenges. And rarely, if ever, does the Muslim have to defend the trustworthiness of the Quran. The Christian simply will not go on the offense. And I think Christians tend to be guilty of that far too often in our witnessing, in our outreach. We are apologists. We are defending the faith. We are giving answer for the hope that is in us, and that's good. We should be doing that. It is mandated in 1 Peter 3:15. But I think we're neglecting offense. We're neglecting to go on the attack. In Jude 3, we read, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. Contend, you see, contend earnestly, not just defend. We are in a battle for people's hearts and minds, and that is pictured as a war more than once in the New Testament. And wars cannot be won solely by defending. At some point, you must attack. Listen to 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3-5, for example. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So here, Paul is speaking of the spiritual war in which we are engaged. He speaks of pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, taking captives. These are all acts of offense, not defense. So as Jesus witnesses, those who carry out the Great Commission, it is our duty not only to defend, but also to go on the offense.
So how do you suggest that we do that, go on the offense?
It has to do with this. Most people live unexamined lives. And by that, what I mean is that from the time most people are born, they begin absorbing ideas and views from around them, from what they see and hear, and they synthesize it into some kind of general understanding of what the world is about, what life is about, what's important, what's not important. And all of these together make up what we call the worldview. Most people don't have a well thought out worldview. They didn't develop it by critical thinking, by asking questions about the things they hear, comparing it with facts, looking for evidence, looking at logic. Most people simply pick up their worldview by osmosis, by absorbing what it is that's around them, what they hear from parents, from schools, from peers, from the media, and so on. And eventually they accept the worldview as true. They just slide into that acceptance, perhaps even not realizing it. And they accept it as true and correct without question. They just assume that it's true.
Oh, so it's like you hear something often enough and loudly enough and you just believe it.
Yes, exactly like that. The non-Christian's worldview obviously is not built around Jesus or the gospel. God or a God may or may not be part of their worldview. They may be secular, they may be hedonistic, nihilistic, existential, postmodern, whatever you have, but it's not Christian, their worldview. The Christian worldview is actually alien to theirs. So when we come to them with the gospel, the burden of proof is on us. We have to prove it. We have to offer reasons to believe, or they stay within their own worldview just by default. They don't set their worldview beside ours to compare and see which one is better, found it. They already accept their own by default, no matter how shaky its basis may actually be. So we have an uphill battle to convince them of the truth of the gospel. And of course, ultimately, it is a spiritual battle.
So what do we do then?
Well, we certainly do need to defend the Bible. We need to answer the challenges, as we've said so often. But sometimes it might help to go on the offense. And by this, I mean, we need to challenge that worldview of theirs, the ones that they've just absorbed by osmosis. We need to hold it up to the test. They will not do that on their own. So we have to try to induce them to examine their own worldview, their own assumptions, their own pre-understandings of what life is about. We need to rock their worldview, so to speak. And that's fair, because that's what they're doing to us.
Is that what Jesus did?
Yes. On a number of occasions, Jesus fielded a question, but he didn't stop at answering the question. He actually turned it back on those asking him to get them to start thinking about their own assumptions. Luke 14, 1-6, for example. In the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees on a Sabbath, there was a man there who had dropsy, and all were watching Jesus to see if it would heal on the Sabbath. Because according to their worldview, their understanding of the law, it was wrong to heal on the Sabbath. And they wanted to see what he would do. And we read this, and Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And, well, they kept silent because they all knew. In their worldview, they all knew it was wrong to heal on the Sabbath because that's doing work. It's wrong to work on the Sabbath. But then Jesus asked them this follow-up question. He says, which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. Well, it's not a surprise they couldn't answer him. They never thought about this disconnect between their worldview. It's wrong to do any work on the Sabbath. It would be wrong for Jesus to heal this man on the Sabbath. And then he points out to them that they themselves would do work on the Sabbath. If their son fell into a pit, they would pull him out. But that's doing work. And not just a son, even an ox. If it had fallen into a pit, they would pull it out. And so on the one hand, they're saying it would be wrong for Jesus to heal on the Sabbath. It's doing work. And Jesus is asking, but wait a minute, would you not also be doing that? And by asking that question, they couldn't answer because it suddenly should be clicking into them that there's a disconnect between their worldview and how they live in reality. Seems that it never occurred to them. Or in Matthew 12, for example, here Jesus has been casting out demons. And the Pharisees have to try to figure out, have to come up with some explanation as to why this fellow that they see as a fraud, how he's able to do that. And their answer is this. They say, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. That's the accusation they brought against Jesus, and maybe they really believed it. But Jesus answers that challenge. He says, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And that's a good and adequate answer to their challenge. Their worldview must be wrong. Satan could not be working against himself by empowering somebody to cast out demons. And that's Jesus' defense against the challenge. But then he goes on offense immediately after. He asks, and if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Now think about that question. We know from the Bible that people marveled at the efficacy with which Jesus cast out demons. They marveled that even the demons had to obey him. Now the Pharisees had exorcists. They had people who tried to cast out demons. I don't think they did much of a good job about it. They believed that their people were doing it by the power of God. And now they're accusing Jesus of doing it by the power of Beelzebub. Well, then there's a problem. How come Jesus is effective and their people are not? How come Jesus is able to cast out the demons so thoroughly and the Pharisees' own people cannot do it? Are we supposed to conclude that Beelzebul has more power than God? Well, the Pharisees can't possibly countenance such an idea. And so they're forced to think through this worldview of theirs, because their view cannot possibly be right here.
Also, it looks like the strategy is to quickly answer the defense and turn it around on them to go on the offense after.
Yes, and it requires some quick thinking on your feet, and you may need some practice at that. But yes, that's what you're doing. Don't put yourself in a position where all you ever do is answer their challenges. They have their own worldview, and you have to then make them give answer for their worldview.
Yeah, because I guess it could be challenging if somebody throws a bunch of assertions at you and then you get in the trap of trying to answer all their assertions for which they may not even give any proof, and then you don't get a chance to go on the offense.
Yes, and this is not part of the specific strategy, but it also helps you to see whether the people are sincere or not. If they're not willing to examine their own worldview, they're not willing to defend it, then it looks as if they're not really interested in truth. Now, here's another example from Jesus doing this. And here's one where Jesus doesn't wait for their question and go on the defense. He goes on the offense right away. To Matthew chapter 22, verses 41 to 46, where we read this. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." And of course, they all knew that, and it was prophesied that this is their worldview. He is the son of David. And then Jesus asked them this question. Verse 43, he said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And that's Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. So David, who's writing this psalm, talks about the Lord, and the Lord said to my Lord, who is the Christ. So David is calling the Messiah his own Lord. And Jesus goes on in verse 45, if David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? You see, that's a problem for them, because in their culture, the older generation is always the Lord of the younger generation. You're not greater than your father Abraham. You're not greater than David, and so on. And yet the Messiah is the son of David, and yet he is the Lord of David. Not surprisingly, we see in verse 46, and no one was able to answer him a word. So every once in a while, Jesus is bringing up things like this that force them to think about their own worldview and see how it just doesn't hold water, how there are inconsistencies that need to be dealt with. And so here are some examples of going on the offense and witnessing. Jesus obviously was pointing to himself, who he was, his mission, what he came for throughout his preaching. But he was also forcing the people to re-examine their own worldview, their own pre-understandings, their own presuppositions, and was seeking to shake those, to open them to hearing what he had to say about himself. And we have a lot of opportunities to do that as well. If you think back to those Christian-Muslim debates that I mentioned, the Muslim apologists will often attack, as I said, the reliability of the gospel books and talk about, we don't know who wrote them, they were written late, they were copied one from another, and they appeal to liberal theologians for this. Now, these are not correct. We have talked before in another program about who wrote the gospel books and how we know that it was, in fact, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were not anonymous. But this is what they will bring up in the debates. There's a number of ways you can respond to that, but one of the things you could do is turn around on them, because the Quran affirms such things as the virgin birth of Jesus, that he did miracles, it affirms creation, it affirms the flood, it affirms the story of Jonah. All of these were affirmed by Jesus, and they're also affirmed by the Quran, but they are all denied by the liberal theologians and the liberal scholars. So the Muslim starts bringing up these liberal theologians and saying, well, we can't trust the gospel books, turn it around on them and ask, if we are to believe these people, then we can't believe the virgin birth, can we? We can't believe Jesus did miracles. We can't believe in the creation account and so on. So that means we also can't believe the Quran. Is that right? And it would be interesting to see how they would answer to that. Now, here's one more example of how it can be used practically. And some people might find this example a little strange, but here's how it goes. Some time ago, the Toronto Star newspaper ran an article on the issue of Darwinism and human altruism, that is doing good for others, even for those people you don't know. And the question was asked, why should one sacrifice himself on behalf of another person, especially a stranger? Because from the point of view of evolution, it doesn't make sense. Evolution is about survival of the fittest, and specifically the drive to pass on your own genes to the maximum number of surviving offspring who are competing for scarce resources with the offspring of others who are trying to pass on their genes. It's all driven by what Dawkins calls the selfish gene. And if you're trying to maximize your offspring at the expense of other people's offsprings, why would you help other people? According to the article, it said after Charles Darwin, scientists asked if survival of the fittest is the rule. Why should humans behave in ways that help their fellows and not themselves to survive? The question was all the more perplexing when geneticists showed that behavior for the good of the species did not necessarily allow altruistic individuals to reproduce their good genes, improving society at large. In fact, they found freeloaders and antisocial individuals had an advantage over the socially responsible because they never paid the cost of being good. So if there is evolution, if there's no God, if evolution is true, there shouldn't be altruism. Faced with this problem, Darwinists paint just so stories. When the opposite of what their theory predicts comes to pass, they try to explain why it happens anyway. And the best they could come up with is that, well, altruism helps the community. But that certainly doesn't apply if you're talking about a community halfway around the world. Now, here's where the example of going on the offense comes into play. 2 days after this article was published, a disaster took place in Indonesia. A massive tsunami came up and dashed across large parts of the coastal land, and it killed 230,000 people. And by any account, this should be considered a terrible tragedy. But there are people who immediately use this to attack God because they said, see, this proves there is no God. God cannot exist. If there were God, he would stop things like this from happening. He cannot possibly exist. But if there is no God, then what? We're left with Darwinism. And if Darwinism is true, then the tsunami was not a bad thing. We should actually consider it a good thing because our genes have a better chance to get passed on. Our offspring have a better chance to survive. There are more resources for us.
But again, doesn't that thing apply about halfway around the world? How does that increase our resources?
On a worldwide scale, it increases it perhaps marginally. But the main point is the survival of those people did not benefit us in any way at all. So it shouldn't matter to us that those people were taken out. There's no sane reason to give that a Darwinist could give. They could not give a reason why. If Darwinism is true, if there's no God, why we should feel bad about the tsunami. Yet we do. We do. Okay, because Darwinism isn't true. We feel bad and they felt bad about it. This is why they questioned God. They said, how can God allow such a terrible thing to happen? They thought it was terrible. But you have to challenge the Darwinist on that, on his worldview. As he points out, according to him, there's no God. Ask him if he cares about that tsunami. Ask him if he feels bad about those lives that were lost. And he will say, yes, of course. And then ask him why. Ask him why he cares. Ask him why, if Darwinism is true, if there's no God, why we should not consider it a good thing. And that sounds terrible to say, and that's not my worldview. In my worldview, I do think it's a bad thing.
Yeah, but then he might just not bother to answer and say, oh, you're a terrible person because you only care because your God tells you to care.
He would then be trying to dodge the question, and this is the point when you're on the offense, you cannot let him dodge the question. If you, the Darwinists, care, you have to give me a good explanation in Darwinian terms of why you care. And they can't. And I'm not sure they would actually come back with that because they've probably never even thought about that before. Why should they care about people on the other side of the globe that they've never met, never will meet, that do not impact on their lives directly in any way at all? And yet they do, which seems to me that tsunami and its results are more of a problem to the view that there is no God. And it just might rock his world to think about that. If he would actually sit down and ask himself something that never occurred to him before, why does he care about these things? Why as a Darwinist can he not say, good, more scarce resources for the rest of us? But he wouldn't think that way. He wouldn't say that way. And he has to then think about it, about this inconsistency in his worldview. But it won't occur to him on his own. It won't occur to him unless we go on the offense and bring that up for him. Every once in a while, we do have to go on the offense.
Only once in a while?
Well, perhaps as many times as you see a good opportunity to do it. You want them to change their worldview and to do so by examining the facts and making an informed choice and not just going with that default worldview that they absorbed without ever really thinking it through. And it does happen. According to the Pasadena Center for World Missions, this is a few years ago now, but at the time they said that every 5 days, 1 million people around the world come to Christ, convert to Christianity. They leave the worldview that they had, that they'd absorbed and they become convinced that Jesus is true. And that means there is a harvest out there. There are people willing to listen. So go ahead, share the gospel, do it patiently, do it wisely, and remember, the best defense is a good offense.
Well, thank you for that helpful information, John. And I guess we will hear more from you next time.
Thank you, Sonia.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.